I used to believe that betrayal wore a villain's face, sharp, cunning, a shadow in the night. But the truth is, it often smiles sweetly across your kitchen table, sipping wine from your favorite glass and asking if the roast chicken needs more time. Her name was Elise. We met in college, both scholarship kids in a sea of inherited wealth, both fighting invisible wars we never talked about. She had a way of laughing like she didn't carry pain, and I, naive as I was then, mistook that for safety. I let her into my world, into my home, into my heart, and eventually, she walked straight into my marriage. I found out in the way women usually do, not from honesty, but from a cracked phone screen, a half-written message, and a silence in my husband's voice that sounded like goodbye. "Don't be mad," he said. "It just happened." As though love is a puddle someone might trip into. Elise didn't deny it. She didn't even apologize. She simply blinked, as if surprised I didn't see it coming. "We didn't mean to hurt you," she said. "Sometimes people grow apart." People. She meant me and him. As if our wedding vows were an expired contract, our years together, Elise, she'd finally decided to take over. But I didn't scream. I didn't cry in front of her. I stood still, calm, the way people do just before a storm breaks. And then I left. I left our house, my house, though the deed bore his name, and checked into a hotel under a name that didn't carry his scent. I hired a lawyer. Not one of those sharp-suited men from glossy billboards, but a quiet woman named Lillian who read between lines for a living. She didn't ask if I was sure. She just looked at me and said, "We'll get everything you're owed." And then, as if life hadn't already played its cruelest hand, came the invitation. Cream envelope, gold foil. The kind that practically screamed money and new beginnings. "You are cordially invited to celebrate the engagement of Elise Harmon and Jonathan Reed." They were getting married. And they had the audacity to ask me to come. No note, no apology, just the glittering lie of civility printed in calligraphy. I imagined her pressing the envelope closed with careful fingers, as if sealing away all memory of what she'd taken. I imagined him watching, indifferent, adjusting his cufflinks, maybe wondering aloud if I'd show. I did, but not alone. The hotel ballroom gleamed under chandeliers, each crystal shimmering like 1,000 tiny truths waiting to be spoken aloud. Every detail of the engagement party was curated to perfection. The champagne flowed like they were drowning guilt in bubbles, and the string quartet played a version of At Last that made me want to laugh and scream all at once. Elise stood at the center, in ivory. Not quite a wedding dress, that would have been too brazen, but close enough to suggest she'd already tried one on. Her hand rested on his chest like it belonged there, her diamond ring catching the light and casting sharp little stars across the room. I walked in on heels I hadn't worn since our 5th anniversary dinner, the one where he toasted to forever with lips that would later press against hers. I wasn't late. I wasn't early. I arrived exactly on time, the hour printed on the invitation, as though it had been written for me alone. They didn't see me at first. That was the thing about people like them. They only saw what they expected to see. A woman broken, banished, silent. But I wasn't silent anymore. Lillian walked beside me in a tailored navy suit, briefcase in hand. Her heels made a quieter entrance, but her presence was thunderous. We moved through the crowd like a whispered threat, calm and inevitable. Someone gasped. I think it was Elise's sister. Jonathan turned, and for a flicker of a second, his face crumbled. Not with shame. With fear. "Elena," he said, like the name still belonged to him. I smiled. "Jonathan," I returned, my voice silk-wrapped steel. "Elise." Elise's smile twitched. She glanced at Lillian, then at the envelope in my hand. I stepped forward and offered it like a gift. "Congratulations," I said, letting the word drip with every lie they'd ever told me. "I brought a little something for you both." Jonathan took the envelope with hesitant fingers. He opened it, and his expression dropped, the practiced smile melting into something raw and panicked. Elise looked over his shoulder, reading quickly, lips parting with each sentence. It wasn't just divorce papers. It was an asset claim. Half of everything, including the business I helped him build, the one he swore I didn't understand. Every contract I reviewed, every client I wooed at dinners he didn't bother to attend, it was all there, documented. Legally mine. You can't be serious, he said, his voice cracking. Oh, I'm more than serious, I replied. You see, you weren't just unfaithful. You were careless. And in your carelessness, you forgot that I still hold the keys to half your kingdom. Elise paled. This is our engagement party. And now, I said, brushing non-existent dust from my dress, it's also the day you realized actions have consequences. Lillian took over then, stepping forward with poise and clarity, explaining the legal logistics with the coolness of winter air. I didn't look back as the murmurs grew, as guests whispered behind manicured hands and phones began to record. I didn't need to see his face again to know what it looked like, not the man I had married, but the man I had unmade. I walked out as the music faltered, as the quartet stopped playing, as the chandeliers shimmered silently above a love built on lies. Let them choke on their cake. The night air outside felt cleaner than it had in years. Or maybe it was me, finally breathing without permission, without apology. Lillian and I stepped into the car waiting at the curb, its interior warm and silent. The kind of silence that doesn't ache, but holds. You sure you're ready for this next part? She asked, watching me through the mirror as the driver pulled away from the hotel. I nodded. I've been ready for years. I just didn't know it until tonight. What they saw as an ambush, I saw as reckoning, not revenge. I wasn't trying to ruin a party. I was reclaiming a decade of my life. Jonathan and I had built something once, a business, a home, a future, and though he'd walked away from the vows, he hadn't walked away from the investments. Not all of them. And legally, emotionally, structurally, he tied more of himself to me than he realized. So, I planned. Quietly. The way women do when the world tells us to sit still. I gathered paperwork, consulted financial experts, found receipts he thought I'd thrown away. I watched him buy Elise gifts with funds from accounts I'd once helped him organize. Every detail I documented. The business, our business, had started at a kitchen table, 2 laptops, 1 dream. I was the logistics, the networking, the damn spine of it all. He was the charm, the handshake, the face. But when he replaced me in his life, he forgot I couldn't be replaced in the books. You could ask for more, Lillian had said early on, given what you brought to the table. But I didn't want to burn the table. I just wanted my seat back and the cutlery that bore my fingerprints. By the time the engagement party arrived, everything was ready. The papers filed, the valuations complete, the court dates tentatively marked. All I had to do was show up. And now I was gone. Later that night, I received the first call. Not from Jonathan. Not from Elise. From his mother. Elena, she said, voice shaking. What happened tonight? Was that really necessary? I closed my eyes and leaned back against the headboard of my hotel bed, suddenly weary. What's necessary, I said slowly, is recognizing that when you betray someone, you don't get to decide how they heal. She's young. She didn't mean. She meant every lie, every smile, every night she spent in the house I made a home. My voice cracked slightly, then steadied. And Jonathan? He meant it too. There was silence. Then, something softer. You were always the stronger one. I didn't respond. I ended the call. Strength. That word. It always came too late, dressed in regret, spoken by those who stood silent when it counted. Where was this praise when Elise played guest and thief in my living room? Where was this reverence when I begged Jonathan to attend therapy, to speak, to stay? I had been strong. I had been soft. I had been everything, and I had been erased. Until now. That night, I slept for 8 uninterrupted hours for the first time in months. The morning after the engagement party, my phone was a battlefield. Texts pinged like bullets, some sharp, some pleading. A few read like attempted ceasefires, draped in false concern. We should talk. You didn't have to do that. You've made your point. But one stood out. It was from Elise. You really think this makes you strong? You just embarrassed yourself in front of everyone. I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed 3 words. You invited me. And that was the truth, wasn't it? I hadn't crashed anything. She sent the envelope. She wanted me there, perhaps to gloat, to prove she'd won. But Elise had never truly understood me. She mistook quiet for weakness, endurance for passivity. She underestimated the fury of a woman who has been both loyal and ignored. And Jonathan? His silence was telling. He hadn't called. He hadn't texted. I imagined him in that sterile penthouse, pacing, rewinding the scene again and again. He was used to being in control. Of the narrative. Of me. He couldn't fathom that I had drawn the boundaries this time. Lillian called mid-morning. They've read the filings, she said without preamble. Their lawyer reached out. They're rattled. I allowed myself a small smile. Good. They'll try to settle, she added. Privately. Quickly. They'll want to make this go away. Let them want, I replied, staring out the hotel window at a world I was beginning to recognize as mine. I've waited this long. I can wait longer. The press caught wind 2 days later. A small blurb at first, buried in the local business section. Co-founder Elena Ward files for equitable interest in thriving marketing firm led by fiancé of social media influencer Elise Harmon. The photo was old. Me in a navy sheath dress, Jonathan beside me, smiling like he still believed in us. The story grew legs by lunchtime. Elise had a following, after all, a curated digital life of latte art and sun-drenched mornings. She posted carefully filtered snippets of her journey from assistant to lifestyle brand CEO. It was a pretty fiction. And now, people were flipping through pages to find the ending. Her comments flooded with questions. The engagement party clips she'd posted vanished within hours. So did her usual morning skincare routine stories. By the week's end, the firm issued a statement vague, defensive. Business as usual, it read. Internal matters being resolved. But the cracks showed. Clients reached out, some cautiously, others directly, asking about my role, about my version. It was surreal. For so long, I had been the invisible partner, the woman behind the spreadsheets and strategies. Now, I was being seen. That Friday, Jonathan requested a meeting. He wants to talk, Lillian said, setting her phone down after the call. Privately. Just you and him. I laughed, not bitterly, but with the kind of clarity that comes from climbing out of wreckage and realizing you're still alive. Of course he does, I murmured. But he doesn't get private anymore. Not with me. He chose a downtown cafe, not the one we used to visit after Sunday markets, but a sleeker, colder place, all steel and glass. I arrived early, seated with my back to the wall, where I could see everything. Control. It mattered now. Jonathan entered in his usual blazer and mask, the one he wore when he wanted to seem composed. But he couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders or the way his eyes searched the room before settling on me. He hesitated, then approached like a man walking into a courtroom instead of a cafe. Elena, he said, taking the seat across from me. I let the silence stretch. Not out of cruelty, but because I'd earned the space. The air between us had been filled with excuses for too long. He exhaled, fingers tapping against his coffee cup. You didn't have to do this publicly. You didn't have to do any of it privately, I replied. He winced. A small, satisfying crack in the mask. Elise. Don't. I raised a hand. This isn't about her. Not anymore. She was the symptom. You were the disease. His mouth opened and shut again. He hadn't expected that. For so long, I had measured my words, careful not to push too hard, to keep the peace. That woman was gone. You're angry, he said. No, I replied evenly. I'm finished. He flinched at that. It always unnerved him when I didn't cry. I made mistakes, he said. But this, taking the business, you're trying to destroy me. No, I said again, slower this time. I'm claiming what I built. You can't destroy what someone never owned alone. His face hardened. What do you want, Elena? I want acknowledgement. I want my share. I want every sleepless night, every sacrificed weekend, every time I held you up while you played visionary to count. He stared at me, and for a moment, I saw fear flicker behind his eyes. Not fear of losing, but fear of being revealed. For years, he had lived a narrative where he was the genius and I was the helper. Now, the world was beginning to see differently. You used to believe in me, he said, quieter now. I did, I whispered. Until I realized you never believed in me. We sat in silence then, the kind that presses against the skin. I want to settle, he said finally. I nodded. Through lawyers. No more private meetings. Elena. I stood, sliding on my coat. Congratulations again on your engagement. And then I left. Again. This time, for good. That evening, I met Lillian in her office, overlooking the city's skyline. You were brilliant, she said, handing me a glass of wine. I wasn't trying to be, I said, watching the lights flicker across the windows. I was just telling the truth. That, she said, raising her glass, is more powerful than anything else. We clinked glasses. Somewhere, a wedding was being replanned. A business was being restructured. And a woman once written out of her own story was now holding the pen. I didn't expect peace to come so quickly. I thought it would take years, maybe decades, to feel like I'd really left him and them behind. But the morning after our final conversation, I woke up to sunlight pooling on the hotel sheets like forgiveness. It wasn't joy, not yet. But it was the absence of ache. A quiet reprieve. A full breath without the weight of his voice in my head. My phone buzzed. Not from Jonathan. Not from Elise. It was from Mara, a friend I hadn't seen in years. We'd grown apart during the height of the business, back when my time was a currency I spent entirely on Jonathan's dreams. Saw the news. Proud of you. Drinks this weekend? I stared at the message, feeling something tremble beneath my ribs. Connection. Genuine. Unfiltered. The kind of friendship I had once buried beneath compromises and calendar invites. I texted back, yes. I'd like that. Over the next week, things unfolded in expected and unexpected ways. Jonathan's lawyer reached out to Lillian with terms. They were generous, at least on paper. Ownership percentages, stock options, buyout clauses. All carefully worded, all meant to suggest kindness, when what they truly reeked of was damage control. Lillian reviewed the documents, then looked at me across her desk. You want to push this further? She asked. No, I said. I want to close this chapter. Let him keep his version of the story, if it helps him sleep. I have what I need. We negotiated for slightly more, and we got it. I walked away with 42% of the company and a payout that, if managed wisely, would allow me to rebuild on my own terms. He could keep the building, the branding, the performative leadership. I'd take the truth. And the freedom. Elise, predictably, reappeared. Not in person. She never could stomach confrontation when she wasn't winning. She posted a captioned photo of her by a window, soft morning light on her face. The caption read, "Growth is painful, but so is betrayal. Some people love you until you stop serving them." A jab, dressed in philosophy. The comments were filled with hearts and stay strongs, but I knew what it really was, her way of rewriting the story before it fully settled. I didn't respond. Let her drown in her curated victimhood. She knew the truth. And so did I. On a quiet Wednesday, I visited my old apartment, the one I left in haste when everything unraveled. It had been cleared, repainted. The rooms echoed with absence. I walked through each space, fingers brushing along walls once hung with pictures. In the closet, I found an old scarf I hadn't packed. I held it to my chest for a moment, then left it behind. Some things, even if once yours, aren't meant to return to you. That weekend, I met Mara for drinks at a rooftop bar. The sky was bruised lavender, and the breeze was cool with early summer's promise. "You look light," she said, sipping her cocktail. "I feel like air," I replied. "Dense in memory, but free." We laughed, not the careful laughter of women watching their tone, but the unguarded kind that spilled without apology. That night, for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, I danced. Not for anyone else. Not to please. Not to prove. Just because the music was playing and I still had feet to move. In the weeks that followed, I began the strange process of becoming someone new, or perhaps returning to someone I'd been before love and loyalty became chains instead of choices. I disappeared from the circles Jonathan and Elise inhabited, unsubscribed from the email lists, blocked the mutual friends who only reached out for gossip. I didn't owe anyone an explanation. That was a hard lesson I'd earned the right to learn. Not every silence demands a defense. But I didn't disappear from the world. In fact, I began to reappear in the places that had once lit me up: galleries, bookstores, lecture halls. Places filled with ideas instead of ego. I'd forgotten how much I loved listening to strangers discuss things that had nothing to do with business margins or quarterly returns. One night, I wandered into a small art show tucked between a flower shop and a record store. It was themed things we almost became. Every piece felt like a mirror, fragmented, honest, full of grief and becoming. One sculpture in particular stopped me. It was a pair of porcelain hands reaching toward each other, suspended inches apart, their fingertips chipped, their wrists cracked open. A small plaque below it read, "What we reached for." I stared at it for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. I simply breathed it in and let it be what it was: beautiful, broken, familiar. Later that week, I received a letter. A real one. Ink and paper. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. It was from Jonathan's mother, Elena. "I won't pretend to understand everything, but I want you to know I've been thinking of you. You were always more than a daughter-in-law to me. You were a light in our family. I'm sorry for what you endured. I hope you find peace, and if you ever want to talk, my door is open. With love, Margaret." I stared at the letter, the ink slightly smudged where her pen had likely paused too long. It wasn't a repair, it wasn't meant to be. But it was acknowledgement. A flicker of warmth from a family that had mostly stood by and watched me unravel. I didn't respond. Not yet. Maybe never. But I folded the letter and tucked it in a box with other fragments I'd chosen to carry the good ones. My days grew fuller, not busier, just more mine. I took a ceramics class, and my first attempt at a bowl collapsed into itself. The instructor smiled and said, "Sometimes broken shapes hold more story." I began journaling again. Longhand. No edits, no filters. Just pages of unburdening. And I started meeting with a small group of women who gathered every Thursday at a cozy cafe to talk not about men, or betrayal, or success, but about freedom. Real, soul-deep freedom. We told stories. Some of them cracked open the room like lightning. Others drifted out like feathers, soft, unassuming, but still powerful. I told mine slowly. Not all at once, but in parts. In pieces. And each time, I felt something loosen. One Thursday, after the group dispersed, I stayed behind. The cafe owner, an older woman with streaks of silver in her braid, brought me a second cup of tea on the house. "You come alive when you speak," she said gently. "You should write it all down." "I've started," I replied, surprised to hear the truth spill out so easily. "Good," she said, placing the cup before me. "Some stories don't just deserve to be told. They need to be." I sat with her words long after she left. Staring out at the city through rain-smeared glass, I realized something profound. I had walked through fire. And I wasn't just surviving. I was writing the ash into gold. There's something strangely comforting about routine when the world has just finished unmaking you. Not the old routines, not packing Jonathan's lunches, not checking his calendar, not managing the team's morale at quarterly meetings while he took credit with clients. No, these routines were gentler. Mornings spent in the sunlit corner of my apartment with a journal and strong coffee. Afternoons wandering secondhand bookstores with no agenda, thumbing through dog-eared pages and lost stories. Evenings sitting barefoot on my balcony, wrapped in a shawl that once belonged to my grandmother, watching the city blink into quiet. I didn't miss him. That startled me. What I missed, when I looked closely, wasn't the man. It was the version of me that used to believe in him. The younger self who still thought love was about holding on tighter, instead of learning when to let go. I mourned her. And then, slowly, I thanked her. Because she tried. She gave everything. And I owed her more than silence and shame. The first essay I wrote for publication wasn't meant to be public. It started as a letter to myself, a piece I called The Cost of Keeping the Peace. I read it aloud at the Thursday group, hands trembling, voice cracking. When I finished, there was no applause, just the kind of silence that means everyone is holding their breath with you. "You need to share that," one of the women whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I submitted it to a small digital magazine that focused on personal essays. I almost didn't send it. I hovered over the submit button for hours. Then, with a defiant breath, I clicked. It was accepted within 3 days. They asked for a photo and a bio. I stared at the prompt. Elena Ward is. Who was I? Not just the woman scorned. Not just the ex-wife. Not just the once partner in a glittering lie. I typed. Elena Ward is a writer, former entrepreneur, and quiet storm. She believes in the healing power of storytelling and the radical act of reclaiming one's voice. When it went live, I told no one. Not even Mara. I needed it to exist without validation. A whisper into the world. But readers found it. Emails began trickling in, strangers thanking me for saying the thing they never had the language for. One woman wrote, "I thought I was crazy for feeling this way. You reminded me I wasn't alone." I wept when I read that. Not out of pride, but recognition of how many women sit in silence, balancing the weight of betrayal with the need to appear composed. I hadn't just written an essay. I'd opened a door, and I had stepped through it first. That same week, I ran into someone unexpected, Ellis, Jonathan's former business partner. The one who used to treat me like furniture, pleasant but irrelevant. He spotted me at the art exhibit for local writers and creatives. I was there to support a fellow woman from the Thursday group who was debuting her poetry. "Elena," he said, brows raised, genuinely surprised. "I almost didn't recognize you." I smiled, slow and unbothered. "That's probably because I'm not he, remember?" He chuckled nervously. "I read your piece," he said, looking everywhere but my face. "Very powerful." "Thank you." A pause. "You know," he added, lowering his voice, "you were always sharper than people gave you credit for." I tilted my head. "That's the thing about credit," I replied. "Eventually, the debt catches up." He blinked. I walked away. It didn't take long for the people who once dismissed me to start circling back, like moths who suddenly noticed the flame they'd once ignored could warm them too. Ellis was only the beginning. 3 days after my essay went viral, I received a message from Simone, one of the executive's wives, someone who used to smile at me like I was a loyal assistant instead of a co-founder. "Elena, just read your piece. So brave. Let's grab coffee soon. I always knew you had so much potential." Potential. I nearly laughed aloud. Where was the support when Jonathan stood in front of a conference room, parroting my pitch deck word for word without once glancing at me? Where was this admiration when Elise started showing up to company retreats as just a friend, while I sat in my room trying to believe I was imagining it? I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because the truth was this: the people who only respect you after your success never respected you at all. I kept writing. More essays. More stories. Not all about Jonathan. Not all about betrayal. Some were about reclaiming joy, the quiet kind that sneaks in on Sunday mornings and reminds you that healing doesn't always roar. I wrote about the time I learned to make my grandmother's tea cake. About the first time I rode a bike alone at age 7 and scraped my knees so badly I still have the scar. About the way I used to hum lullabies to myself during late-night spreadsheet sessions because no one thought to ask how I was doing. And slowly, something happened. Publishers started reaching out. Podcasts invited me to speak. One editor even said, "Your voice is exactly what women need right now." I paused when I read that, because for so long, I thought my voice didn't matter. That being gentle was the same as being weak. That softness was a flaw, but it was my softness, my endurance, my quiet seeing that had carried me through the wreckage. My voice wasn't new. It was just no longer buried. One night, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. Then curiosity, or perhaps a flicker of old reflex, made me check it. It was Elise. "Elena, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from. But I read your essays. All of them. And I think I understand now. What I took. Not just from you, but from myself. Please, can we talk?" I stared at the message for a long time. I didn't feel rage or satisfaction. I felt pity for the girl who thought stealing someone's life would make her feel whole. For the man who thought loving 2 women meant neither would ever really know him. I deleted the voicemail. Some stories don't deserve a sequel. At the next Thursday group meeting, I read a new piece. It wasn't angry. It was tender. It was titled, "What We Grow in the Silence." It was about the things I'd planted in the aftermath and how they were blooming. When I finished, one of the women reached for my hand. "Do you know what I see when you read?" she said. "A woman who's not just survived, but reinvented the definition of power." I smiled. And for once, I believed her. By the end of the 3rd month, my name was on the contributor list of 3 publications. Small, yes. But each one chosen, earned. Not because I had whispered in anyone's ear, not because I had slept beside power, but because my words spoke truth in a world starved for it. Mara threw a little dinner in her apartment, nothing flashy, just candles, takeout, and laughter, to celebrate my latest piece. To rising from the ashes, she toasted, lifting her wine glass. I clinked mine gently against hers. "Not ashes," I corrected softly. "Soil. Burned things still grow." That night, we talked late into the evening. About love and loss and how sometimes the person you miss is the version of yourself you abandoned for someone else. "Would you do it differently?" she asked me, the question lingering between us like steam from our tea. I thought for a moment. "No," I said. I needed to believe in that love. I needed to lose it to find something better. Which was myself. Meanwhile, Jonathan was unraveling, not loudly, not scandalously, but in small, visible cracks. I didn't follow him. I didn't need to. But word found me anyway. 2 clients pulled out of his firm after the essays. Investors grew nervous. Elise, it seemed, had taken an indefinite break from the spotlight, citing mental health and creative reinvention. I didn't wish them harm. I truly didn't. I had outgrown the part of me that wanted anyone to suffer just because I had. But I did hope they would one day sit still in their silence and listen, really listen, to the echoes of what they had done. Not for my vindication, but for their own reckoning. Because until you face yourself in the mirror you tried to shatter, you'll never see the pieces that still bleed. One afternoon, while walking through a park where the trees were finally starting to bloom, I stopped to watch a little girl learning how to roller skate. She fell, hard, and for a second, looked as if she might cry. Her mother rushed over, but instead of picking her up, she crouched beside her and said, "What do we do when we fall?" The little girl sniffled. "We try again." "No," the mother corrected, kissing her forehead. "We feel it first. We cry if we need. Then we try again." I stood there, tears quietly slipping down my cheeks. That was it. That was the thing no one had ever told me. That trying again isn't strength. Feeling is. For so long, I'd been praised for my grace under pressure, my ability to not make a scene. But healing, I realized, had nothing to do with how well you hide the hurt. It had everything to do with giving it room to breathe. Later that night, I opened a blank page and titled it, Chapter 1. Not of an essay, not of a letter, but of a book. My story. The full one. Not just about Jonathan and Elise, but about growing up invisible. About all the times I was overlooked, underestimated, almost enough. About the courage it takes to stay kind in a world that rewards cruelty. About the truth that silence, when broken by honesty, can become a song. The first chapter poured out of me in a single night. I didn't try to make it perfect. I didn't worry about grammar or tone. I wrote like I was bleeding, like the story had waited too long and now wouldn't let me sleep. It wasn't about Jonathan. Not anymore. He was merely the doorway. The house, the whole story, was mine. It started with childhood memories, ones I hadn't dared examine in years. Like the time I won the regional spelling bee and my father shook his head because my cousin had made varsity soccer instead. Or the way my mother would sigh and say, "Why do you have to be so sensitive?" as if my feelings were crimes. I wrote about the jobs I took to support Jonathan's startup, how I skipped vacations, foregone promotions, stayed up till 3 a.m. fixing pitch decks he would present as his own. I wrote about the loneliness of being loyal to someone who only loved you when it served him. And I wrote about the unraveling, how it didn't happen all at once, but thread by thread. A late-night text from Elise he forgot to delete. A dinner I planned that he never showed up for. The silence that crept into bed between us like a third body. By morning, I had 7,000 words and sore fingers. I slept with the document open beside me like a sacred relic. The next few weeks moved like wind over water. Fast in motion, but calm in essence. I started attending a small writing group downtown, not one of those polished networking circles, but a dimly lit basement full of dreamers and misfits. We read aloud our raw pages, shared critiques, offered each other the kind of tenderness the world often withholds. There was a woman there named Tasha. She wrote poetry about surviving abuse, about replanting her life in soil that once held her pain. "You write like a blade dipped in honey," she told me after my first reading. I laughed, caught off guard. "What does that even mean?" "It means," she said, "you tell the truth even when it tastes sweet." Around this time, I got a message from my old mentor, Sophia, one of the few women in the industry who had once pulled me aside and whispered, "Don't let him dim you." She'd read my essays. She wanted to meet. We sat at a little bistro on the edge of the city, sipping espresso under golden lamps. "I always knew," she said, leaning in, "that you were going to burn the whole illusion down one day." "It wasn't on purpose," I replied. "Of course not," she smiled. "But purpose doesn't always require planning. Sometimes it's what happens when you finally stop shrinking." Sophia offered me something I didn't expect, a seat on a new project. A collective publishing initiative designed by women, for women. Real stories, raw voices. You'd have full control, and no one can rewrite your words this time. I took it, not because I needed the platform, but because I had finally found my voice. And I was done giving it away. Sometimes healing doesn't feel like a breakthrough. It feels like a quiet morning when you realize you haven't thought about him, not even once, until now. And, even then, not with pain. Just distance. I was folding laundry, listening to an old jazz record, when I stumbled upon a sweater I hadn't worn in over a year. One of Jonathan's favorites, soft gray cashmere, a gift from me on his 34th birthday. For a moment, my fingers hovered over the fabric. Then I folded it gently, placed it in the donation bag, and kept going. Grief, I've learned, is not a wound that scabs over. It's a door that swings open at odd times. You just learn to greet what walks through it with grace. A few days later, I received an email from Elise. Yes, again. This one wasn't bitter. It wasn't laced with performative strength or passive digs. It was human. "Elena, I read your latest piece about the bookstore and the little girl who chose a battered copy of *And of Green Gables over the shiny new edition. The The part where you wrote, "Sometimes we pick what's worn because we know it's survived something." Asterisk, that line destroyed me. I've been doing a lot of therapy. Real therapy. Not Instagram quotes and bubble baths. And it turns out I have a lot to unlearn. Especially about what love isn't. I know this doesn't make anything better. But I wanted to say I see you now. Truly. And I'm sorry. For everything. Asterisk. Elise. I read it twice. Then a third time. Then I closed my laptop. I didn't respond. Not out of spite. But because some apologies are meant to sit in the air, not be bounced back like tennis balls. I didn't need closure. I'd already given it to myself. The writing group invited me to headline their fall showcase. The theme, resurrection. I hesitated at first. My instinct was still to step back, to lift others instead of stepping forward myself. But one night, I remembered a moment from years ago when Jonathan had once said during a board meeting, "Elena prefers the background. She's not the spotlight type." And for the first time in a long time, I laughed out loud. He was wrong. I hadn't preferred the background. I was just never given the stage. The night of the showcase, I wore a midnight blue dress, one I'd bought with the money from my first published piece. My hair curled at the ends, my lips a shade called victory. I stood in front of a full room of strangers and friends and read from my manuscript. The passage was about silence and the soft power of choosing your voice over vengeance. When I finished, the applause wasn't loud. It was long, sustained, reverent. Someone in the back stood, then another. Not a standing ovation for a performance, but a recognition that this woman had rebuilt herself, brick by brick, word by word. A week after the showcase, I received an offer from a small publishing house in New York. They didn't want to change a word. They didn't want to soften my tone or revise the shape of my story to make it more digestible for readers who flinch at women's anger. They wanted it as it was, raw, resolute, resonant. The book would be titled What We Reclaim. And I would be its author, not a co-signer on someone else's success, not the nameless woman behind a logo, not Jonathan Reed's ex-wife. Just me, Elena Ward. With the book came new momentum. A podcast reached out. Then a speaking engagement. Then a women's summit in the Pacific Northwest, where I would sit on a panel titled Rewriting Your Narrative. Each time I said yes, I felt a flicker of guilt. Not because I doubted myself, but because a part of me, the old part, still believed I was supposed to be small. But I was tired of shrinking. Tired of tiptoeing around other people's comfort to protect their version of who I was. I wasn't a mirror anymore. I was the light. At the summit, I shared a stage with women who had risen from ashes darker than mine, women who'd walked through war zones, escaped cults, survived betrayals that still echoed in their sleep. We didn't compare scars. We recognized each other in them. One woman, a domestic violence survivor, pulled me aside after the panel. "I don't relate to every part of your story," she said, "but I relate to the silence. And how loud it becomes when no one hears you." We hugged, not the kind of hug you give to be polite, but the kind that says, "I know this language. I speak it too." When I returned to the city, my publisher sent the first draft of the book cover. It was simple. Just a door, slightly ajar, with golden light spilling from the crack. I stared at it for a long time. "Do you like it?" the designer had written in the email. I typed back, "I love it. It's exactly how this chapter of my life feels. Like I finally opened the door that was always mine to walk through." That night, I lit a candle on my windowsill and wrote a letter I'd never send. To Jonathan. I wrote not because I had anything left to say, but because closure, I've learned, is something you give yourself, not something you're gifted by the person who hurt you. You were a lesson. And I was the girl who took notes. But I don't need your apology, or your acknowledgement, or even your memory. I am not the woman who stood in your shadow anymore. I am the architect of my own light. I folded the letter, burned it, and watched the ash rise unburdened. The apartment I'd moved into after leaving Jonathan was always meant to be temporary, a soft landing after the fall. But as the seasons shifted, I found myself lingering. I started planting herbs in the windowsill, framing old photos not of people, but of places I'd traveled alone. A cafe in Lisbon, a bookstore in Kyoto, a fog-drenched trail in the Smoky Mountains. Every corner slowly began to reflect me. Not the version he loved, not the version that Elise envied, just Elena. The book was entering final edits when a curious email arrived. From a law firm I didn't recognize. Apparently, Jonathan was selling the company. His team wants to settle all remaining obligations tied to your equity, Lillian explained over the phone. They're hoping you'll sign a clause that forfeits your name on any public filings. I laughed. He wants to rewrite history, erase my part in the foundation. Yes, she said, calm as ever. And they're offering a significant payout for the privilege. Do I lose anything real if I agree? Lillian paused. Just the visible proof. The credit. I considered it. There was a time I would have clung to the name, the title, the printed legacy. But now I saw something bigger. I didn't need the world to see my name etched into his walls. I was building my own house, brick by brick, story by story. Fine, I said. Let them buy the illusion. I'll keep the truth. She chuckled softly. Remind me not to play chess with you. Mara and I celebrated the final signing with matcha and vegan scones from a little corner bakery. We sat outside, sunlight warming our shoulders, and watched strangers pass with the kind of quiet contentment I used to think only existed in novels. Do you ever think about dating again? She asked, not prying, just curious. I do, I said, honestly. But I'm not searching. I think I want to fall in love without urgency next time. With someone who doesn't need to be rescued or impressed. Just seen. She nodded, sipping her drink. That sounds like the right kind of love. Or, I smiled, no love at all, and I just adopt a big dog and learn pottery. We laughed, the easy kind, born from mutual freedom. That evening, I received a message from a reader. A woman in her 60s. Your words made me forgive the girl I was at 25. The one who stayed. The one who didn't leave sooner. Thank you for that. I stared at the message, hand resting lightly over my heart. Because that was the real gift of this journey, not the book, not the applause, not even the freedom. It was the quiet revolution of knowing I had made someone else feel less alone. And that, I realized, was worth more than any name etched into a building I no longer entered. The day the final manuscript went to print, I stood in front of my mirror for a long time. Not checking my hair. Not adjusting my posture. Just looking. It had been so long since I'd really seen myself without comparing my reflection to someone else's expectations. There had always been a script playing in my head, Jonathan's comments about my too serious face, Elise's backhanded compliments, my mother's warnings not to be too much. But now? I saw a woman who had walked through betrayal and built a bridge out of the broken pieces. A woman who had loved deeply, lost thoroughly, and yet somehow returned to herself more whole than before. Not in spite of the pain, but because of it. The book's release came on a rainy Thursday in early spring. No balloons. No launch party. Just an email from the publisher and a soft ping from the tracking app letting me know the first print copy had arrived at my doorstep. I brought it in carefully, like it might shatter. The cover was perfect, that golden door, slightly ajar. I traced my name with one finger. No tears. Just awe. I made tea and sat by the window, reading the first chapter aloud to no one but the rain. The next few days were a blur. Reviews started trickling in, kind, thoughtful, often emotional. Women wrote about reading it in secret at work, on lunch breaks, in the bath while their partners watched TV. One woman said she hadn't cried in 10 years, but my words unlocked something she didn't know was still buried. I didn't feel proud, exactly. I felt right. As if my words had finally found the ears they were always meant for. Then came the podcast interview. The host, Maya, was known for her empathy and grit, a survivor herself, someone who had left an abusive marriage and now gave others space to speak. "Elena," she said during the recording, "if you could go back to that moment, the one where you walked into the engagement party with your lawyer, what would you say to that version of yourself?" I paused. Then, softly, "I'd say, thank you. For not burning down. For walking in steady. For not screaming, even when you had every right. For showing the world that you can be furious and still graceful. Asterisk." Maya leaned into the microphone, quiet. "That," she said, "might be the most powerful thing anyone's ever said on the show." Afterward, I received a message from a familiar number. Not Jonathan's. His sister's. Asterisk, I don't know if this is overstepping, but I just wanted to say I've been reading your book. I remember so many dinners where you said almost nothing, and now I see it wasn't because you had nothing to say. It was because we never made space for you. I'm sorry for that. And I'm proud of you. Asterisk. I didn't respond right away. I let the message sit like a stone in my palm, warm with meaning. Then, simply, I typed, "Thank you. That means more than you know." In the months following the book's release, I began writing letters I never planned to mail. It became a ritual. Each Sunday morning, curled on the window seat with chamomile tea and the sun sliding through the curtains, I'd pull out a small journal labeled unsent and begin. The first one was to my younger self. Asterisk, you were not wrong to love him. You were not wrong to stay as long as you did. You were loyal, not weak. You were patient, not passive. And you did not deserve to be left behind in the story you helped build. Asterisk. I wrote one to Elise, though I never told anyone. You didn't steal him. He gave himself away. And what you took, I now see, was never mine to hold forever. I hope someday you learn that a life built on someone else's ruin will always shake beneath your feet. And one to Jonathan. Asterisk, you mistook my silence for consent. My steadiness for surrender. But now I see that I was not holding you up, I was holding myself hostage. I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. Asterisk. None of these letters were about reopening doors. They were closures. Tiny folded acts of freedom. I began to speak at universities, mostly women's colleges, though sometimes I was invited into MBA programs and creative writing classes. I told my story not for sympathy, but to offer a compass to anyone who'd been made invisible. After one talk, a girl barely out of high school approached me, eyes wide. "You made me feel less alone," she said. "Like maybe I'm not broken for wanting more." "You're not," I said, brushing her arm gently. "You're just awake." One day, I visited my old neighborhood. I didn't plan to. I was driving past when I saw the florist shop that used to supply our centerpieces for holiday dinners, and on impulse, I pulled over. The Clarksons still owned the house next door, the same one where Elise had stood laughing over cocktails on summer nights while I scrubbed wine stains off my favorite dress. I walked down the block slowly, as if treading on memory. When I reached the driveway of my old home, I paused. It looked smaller now. Not because it had changed, but because I had. A new family lived there. Children's drawings lined the front window. A tricycle leaned against the porch rail. Life had moved on. So had I. I didn't knock. I didn't linger. I simply smiled at the house, whispered thank you, and walked away. Back home, I lit a candle. Not for grief, but gratitude. Because I had loved. Because I had learned. Because I had left. And because I had finally come home to myself. Spring came in soft waves, early blossoms nodding along city sidewalks, the scent of fresh beginnings floating through open windows. There was something healing about the rhythm of it all, how the earth returned to bloom without asking anyone's permission. I began doing the same. I no longer waited for invitations, not to speak, not to rest, not to want. I no longer measured my worth by who acknowledged it. And with each quiet act of rebellion, each yes to myself, each no to guilt, I found another piece of me I thought I had lost. One morning, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a hardcover copy of What We Reclaim, but not the version I'd signed for the publisher. This one had notes in the margins, delicate pencil marks circling entire paragraphs. Some were hearts. Others were single words, true. Ouch! Yes. And on the inside cover, a single message. Asterisk, thank you for speaking when so many of us were still too afraid to use our voices. A woman who needed to hear it. Asterisk. I sat with that book in my lap for nearly an hour. Not reading. Just holding it. It wasn't the praise that moved me. It was the connection, the sacred, invisible thread between strangers who'd lived through different stories, but carried the same ache. This, I thought, is what art is for. Not acclaim, but communion. A month later, I was invited to give a keynote at a women's leadership retreat in the Rockies. The theme was rooted strength. I stood on a wooden platform beneath a canopy of pines, the air brisk, the women wrapped in blankets and resolve. I told them a story not about betrayal, but about becoming. About how sometimes you don't grow in spite of what broke you. You grow because of it. Because being shattered forces you to choose what pieces are worth keeping. I read a passage from the chapter titled The Lawyer and the Lace Dress, the one where I stood in the ballroom, smile fixed, papers in hand, reclaiming more than just assets. When I finished, no one clapped. Instead, they stood. Slowly, silently, as if applause would cheapen what we'd just shared. And in that stillness, I felt something settle inside me, a sense of arrival. Later that night, one of the older women approached me by the fire pit. Her name was Dorothy, and she had eyes like windows during a thunderstorm, clear, heavy, honest. "You're not done writing," she said. I smiled. "I've already started the next one." She chuckled. "Good. The world needs more women who refuse to be footnotes."